Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The day before these events are told, the girl who was one of the main characters of this story was killed. However, before her death, she saw the one who killed her, and it was her own father. The man just walked up to her and threw her into the fire. Without even thinking about anything, he just did it. This girl's name was Saraphina van Tillman. She was born as the second princess of the Gilman kingdom. However, unlike her other sisters, she did not have any special abilities. And she also didn't have any wings that could symbolize the divine blood that flowed in her veins. And that meant that she was a half-blood princess. And because of that, of course, she was treated with quite a bit of prejudice from everyone else. One day, one of the divine people came to her father and said that the existence of a wingless princess simply degraded the dignity of the royal family. The man then seriously considered this, but asked him to leave Saraphina alone. He explained his position by saying that if she were left alone, she would live as if she were already dead. At that very time, the girl was standing right under the door and heard this conversation, which simply hurt her inside. In fact, as they said, she was very quiet in the palace, pretending that she did not exist at all. However, on the day she came of age, Saraphina was able to find a way to prove her worth to her family. She came to her father and said that she wanted to give him a weapon that was endowed with a soul. This was a new type of weapon that no one in the world had before. A special weapon that could allow even those who have never killed to commit these murders with ease. In the midst of the wars of conquest, the kingdom of Tillman won a number of victories thanks to this very weapon that the man had adopted. Hamas, to create this weapon, someone's soul was needed. Otherwise, it would not exist. It was a special weapon in exchange for someone's human life, and the girl really did it in order to become important to her family. Condemn her. They did not understand how it was possible to kill people in order to create a weapon. These people called her a disgusting villain who only thinks about herself. They considered this very wrong and immoral. Saraphina thought that a powerful weapon would soon put an end to the war, and so she took such a step in order to create it. However, to her great regret, the war never ended, and the situation around her only worsened. And while the war was going on, the girl created 8 different types of weapons that had souls embedded into them. However, instead of ending the war, this weapon only took more lives and made the girl suffer. So from that moment on, she swore to herself that she would never make such a weapon again, because she knew it was wrong. When she told her father about this, he came to her and asked her to do at least one thing. He promised that if she did it, then this world would belong to them, and then everything would be fine. Also, when the girl refused to do this, he asked her to teach him how he could create this weapon from the soul. But Saraphina didn't answer him. She only refused her father, which made him doubt her loyalty. How the princess had turned away from them. He even began to suspect that she would start making this weapon for another kingdom. Of course, they were very tolerant and tolerated her until she stopped supplying them with weapons because they were incredibly important to them. Now that his daughter had stopped creating weapons for them and was acting like this, the father thought that there was no longer any need for her. The weapons that he had in himself, so that she would not betray them under any circumstances and would not make the situation even worse. So he was just going to kill Saraphina, his own daughter, out of greed and mercantilism. Thus, her father immediately threw her into the lava, and she only burned to ashes because she could not save herself in any way. But at that moment, as she felt a burning pain throughout her body, she closed her eyes. When she opened them, she realized that her body was no longer burning. She simply could not breathe. Saraphina, looking around, noticed that she was in the water, and because of this, she was having some difficulty breathing. Opening her eyes, she saw that the guards had come to her aid, and one of them was able to pull her out from under the water. The man helped her up, and Saraphina, breathing heavily, coughed up all the water that remained in her lungs after that. After she finished coughing, he immediately turned to her and asked if the girl was okay, and also called her his lady. She, hearing about this, was very surprised, immediately looked at the stranger and asked, was it really he who addressed her in this way, calling her? Stop joking like that, because she needed to be dealt with according to the law. He also said that since she fell into a sacred fountain where baptismal rites are performed, she was arrested for damaging state property. Seraphina didn't really listen to him because, having looked more closely, she noticed some unfamiliar symbol on his uniform, which she had never seen before. Handcuffed, she immediately realized that they were going to put her in jail for some violation of the rules. Then, just passing by this fountain, she looked at her reflection in the water and was very surprised because her appearance was now completely different. Seraphina couldn't understand what had happened to her face because it had been different before. But she didn't even have time to take a good look at herself because she was taken away to the dungeon. Began to resist and asked for someone to listen to her. Was some kind of misunderstanding because she was not a noble woman at all, and the body she was in now was not even hers. The guard began to remove her handcuffs, since now she could not harm anyone, and said that even if she behaved like a crazy person, they were still not going to let her out. He also said that he would remove the handcuffs so that it would not be so stuffy and hard for her to sit in the cell. When he detached them, he said that, besides, the fountain was not deep enough to kill anyone, so her attempt was completely pointless. The man explained that if she wanted to attract the attention of her fiancé, His Highness the Crown Prince, then she had better come up with some other way next time, because this one definitely didn't work. Seraphina looked at him in surprise. As soon as she heard about the Crown Prince, she immediately asked who he was. The guard was really surprised that she was asking such strange questions, but he said that she was the fiancée of His Highness the Crown Prince. He also named her as the Empire's only confidant, Lady Saraphina von Rubia. The girl was surprised that he called her by her former name, but now she was downright noblewoman of the entire empire. After thinking for a while until the man left, she asked when the kingdom of Telman could have become an empire. And the guard immediately replied that the empire had existed for more than 500 years, so he didn't understand what she was even asking about. As soon as the girl heard this number, she immediately felt heavy at heart. She could not believe that such a long time had really passed. Terrible place, she could only meet people who had no wings, and they seemed so free and ordinary. These were people who had once been oppressed, but in the end they managed to build an entire empire. So Seraphina even wondered if she really was that many years in the future and not in the past. A person who had a similar name. But even this was hard for her to comprehend, because she was absolutely sure that she had died forever. But now Seraphina stood, completely alive, in a different form, in a prison cell. So she was incredibly curious about what had happened to her. Some time passed from that moment, and the girl was finally released from prison, and she returned to the estate, where she was immediately met by the senior servant. As soon as she saw Seraphina, she immediately said that she had finally arrived. The woman also replied that she had heard the story, and asked if it was true that the girl had fallen into the fountain. When she shook her head, she continued speaking, saying that the Duke had saved the princess and rescued her, so she should definitely express her gratitude a little later, and all because she had to wash herself immediately. The maid explained that she had already filled the entire bathtub with hot water in advance so that she could wash away the smell of the prison cell. Then suddenly Seraphina, passing by the maids, noticed their conversation. One of the girls said that they could not believe that she fell into the fountain and because of this ended up in prison. Looked better than her if he did that. Could show any interest in her. As soon as Seraphina came closer to them, she immediately looked at the girls with a very cold-blooded look, thereby letting them know that they had crossed the line of what was permitted. One of the maids, laughing nervously, immediately began to leave and asked her for forgiveness. And before going up to the bathroom, the girl thought about how there are always subordinates who look down on their superiors, and it doesn't matter what your status is. They are always present. After thinking about this, she began to go upstairs, because she really wanted to take a bath. In fact, if seniors look down on others, then subordinates will act the same way, so she was able to draw certain conclusions. Of course, for Seraphina, all this was not a new discovery at all, because this is exactly what had happened to her before. There would be no service personnel there, because they were rather biased towards her, and she realized this already in the first minutes of her stay there. But the moment Seraphina undressed and was left in only her nightgown, she looked closely at her hands and was amazed. And the girl was so surprised because all her wrists, and not only them, were covered in some kind of cuts. She assumed that her body had most likely been subjected to physical violence. However, when she looked more closely and noticed the location of these scratches, She concluded that she had inflicted them on herself. After this, Saraphina moved closer to the mirror, and looking at her face realized that despite the fact that she was now the princess of the empire, she was still as lonely as in her past life. When the next morning came, the girl was sitting on her bed. It was quite sunny in her room, but this did not make her happy at all. And she realized that it was not a dream from her past life. She had actually moved into a new body. Feels that she will have to somehow accept the fact that she is now Princess Rubia. But then suddenly she began to feel not very well and coughed loudly without stopping for several minutes. Various memories gradually began to come to her, which actually belonged to the original owner of this body. Princess Saraphine Rubia suffered from a very rare disease that is almost impossible to cure, and also from depression. The guard had told her that Saraphina had simply thrown herself into the fountain to attract attention, but now the girl realized that this was not the case. The owner of her body really just wanted to die that way. The fountain was located in the place where the baptism of a high-ranking nobleman, who is at least 100 days old, takes place. And in this baptism, the birth of a new life is blessed. And knowing that she would not die because the water was shallow, Saraphina swallowed some medicine and jumped into the fountain to make sure that this happened. This way she would be able to be reborn in another, healthier body. Absolutely everyone, including Saraphina herself, knew that she would soon die due to a rare, incurable disease. So those around her treated her as if she had already died. And all because the girl tried to attract people's attention, even if it meant being stupid and doing unreasonable things. She didn't want to be simply taken and erased from memory when she died. So the girl tried in every way to leave a mark on the history of these people. And outraged by Saraphina's behavior, her family gradually began to simply ignore the girl. And when the servants noticed this, they began to act and treat her in the same way. Of course, Saraphina, who reincarnated into this body, was incredibly angry that, despite the fact that her body and times had changed, the situation remained the same. And she even felt sympathy for the original owner of the body, because she understood perfectly well what emotions the girl was experiencing. And now that it came down to it, she had to side with the original owner of the body. Saraphina believed that she needed to find out how she ended up in this place, so she was going to do that in the near future. As she was about to get out of bed, a maid knocked on her door and said that her food was ready. Saraphina did not keep them waiting long. She immediately changed her clothes and went downstairs. But as soon as she saw the plate of food that stood in front of her, she immediately felt sick. One type of food was so horrible that she couldn't even sit next to it, and then she was offered to eat it. As soon as one of the maids noticed that Saraphina had not even touched her food, she asked with a smile on her face, "Is something really wrong?" Of course, the girl began to be incredibly irritated by this. She thought that it was shameless of her to act like this, the food before giving it to the princess. Saraphina understood that if she was now going to have to live like Princess Rubia, then first she would have to deal with this inappropriate behavior from the maids. The maid, turning away from her, asked what she meant, since she had no idea what kind of food inspection she was talking about. But she also said that she was quite sure that this plate had been prepared for Saraphina. The girl then sighed heavily, turned towards her, and said that she understood everything. But in that case, she said that the maid should try it first. Of course, the maid began to worry a little about this, but she said that of course she could not eat food that belonged to the princess. Saraphina, smiling evilly at this point, said that she suspected that the food might be poisoned, so she would like the maid to check everything properly. The girl immediately replied that, of course, this could not be true, so the princess had nothing to worry about at all. But the woman said that they couldn't know for sure, so you always need to make sure that your assumption is correct. She looked at the maids and said that of course they couldn't know. However, no matter what position a girl occupies, there will always be people who will begin to suspect something. Of course, the maid didn't like this arrangement at all, because she had heard that there was no one who could believe in this lady. So she thought that she would just go along with it and try to get a significant severance pay as a reward. But now, as she stood before the princess, she didn't understand. Would she really have to try this food? Saraphina insisted on her own and said that if the girl was afraid that there might be poison in this food, then she certainly shouldn't worry. After all, she had a doctor who could come running immediately if she allowed him to do so. So, without thinking twice, The maid immediately took the plate in her hands and with a trembling hand brought the food to her mouth, and then she took a very small piece into her mouth. As soon as the girl began to take the spoon away from herself, Saraphina grabbed her hand and, moving it closer to herself, told her that under no circumstances should she spit out this food, but should swallow it. Another maid ran up to her and, looking at the princess in surprise, said that she thought that some kind of mistake had occurred, doing something wrong. So she replied that she would prepare something else for the princess, since this food was completely unsuitable. However, Saraphina immediately said that she should not do this, and that the girl should be called to the head maid. After some time, the maid did come to the princess and said that she heard that she was called. The princess immediately replied that the maids serving her were not suitable for work in the duke's household, and she asked how the maid had trained them at all, since they could not do elementary things. What she was talking about, so she asked the girl for forgiveness and said that she was completely innocent. But Saraphina understood perfectly well that they were, of course, all in cahoots, which is why they were putting on such an innocent face. But after that, she said that it was very disappointing to her, and asked if the head maid couldn't see what was going on among all the other servants. The maid was silent for a while, but then said that she thought there was just some misunderstanding. After looking at her dish, she also added that she would give the chef strict orders to make sure that this never happened again. But Saraphina at that moment, without thinking twice, grabbed the plate with the slops on it and poured the entire contents right onto the maid's head. Of course, the head maid was incredibly surprised, but she had no right to say an extra word, so she just stood with her head down, asked what she was doing, but she did not have time to say anything. Saraphina, in a very rude voice, looking at her arrogantly, said that she mistook her for a trash can, and also said that it was a pity that such a misunderstanding had occurred, but she would definitely make sure that next time it did not happen again. The maid immediately became incredibly angry. She replied that she could not believe that Saraphina actually stood in front of her and spilled food on her, but now she said that it was an unnecessary misunderstanding. She did not wait for an answer from the girl, and passing by, pushed her by the shoulder. She said that, of course, she could not stand it anymore, so she also added that she would inform the Duke of Rubia about this. Saraphina stood there looking away and asked, "What exactly is the maid going to tell her father? Does she feel bad because she scolded her for allowing the princess to be served spoiled food?" The maid, hearing these words, immediately stopped in her tracks, because she understood that the girl was indeed right. Saraphina continued speaking and said that she was surprised that the maid could boldly declare all this, but she also added that she should really go and tell him, but immediately after that, the food they served her would be sent to him so that he could personally see what he was serving to the princess. So the girl turned to the head maid and said that she really thought the girl had something to discuss with her father, so she asked how about visiting him right now. The maid immediately took a few steps back from the princess and with a trembling voice addressed the lady. She was about to say something but changed her mind, remained silent and even apologized, but now everything was somehow strange and different. At that moment, Saraphina said that she shouldn't worry at all. She wouldn't tell the man about it. The maid immediately asked in surprise, "Is that really true?" And the princess replied that instead, the girl should fire all the servants who were present and train the new ones so that they would want to serve her. Saraphina also said that if the head maid did her job well, she could even give her a brooch. At that moment, she showed the decoration to the woman. The princess also said that she would still have to do her job in a way that would satisfy the princess. When the maid heard this, she was, of course, a little surprised and even scared, because she did not know what to do and what decision to make. When she looked at the princess, she noticed that her gaze, her gestures, all this was something she had never seen before. The maid concluded that the young lady had changed completely, and she did not know how it could have happened so quickly. But now everything was different. After some time, Saraphina finally had a normal breakfast and went to her room. She sat on the sofa and read a book in order to somehow spend time normally. By that time, the head maid had already found new maids, and one of them, sorting through the girl's wardrobe, asked, was she really going to beg for all the clothes? The princess put the book aside and said that it was true. She needed to get rid of everything. The maid, looking at the various outfits, said that they were incredibly beautiful, and it was very surprising to her that she wanted to get rid of them. But Saraphina replied that this was completely normal. She no longer needed them, so things that were no longer needed had to be gotten rid of. At that moment, she herself thought that, despite the fact that these things could be useful to the familiar owner of the body, now they would no longer be useful to her, so she believed that it would be right to simply get rid of them. Then, suddenly, the girl started coughing. As always, because of her terrible illness, she had to cough continuously for several minutes. The maid, who encountered this for the first time, immediately turned to the lady and asked if everything was okay with her, because she was really worried. But the princess, looking at her, replied that it was only a small cough, but she was perfectly fine, so she did not need to worry about it. Saraphina already thought at that moment that, if you think about it, this maid had only recently started her job, and she herself was feeling a little bad. But if she wanted to fire the head maid, then she simply had no other choice. That's why at that moment the girl lowered her head and began to sigh heavily. The maid, who was sorting through the things, immediately asked, "Did something really happen?" The princess, adjusting her hair, replied that she still could not find her expensive accessory. As soon as the maid heard this, she even jumped up in surprise and asked, "Is this really true?" Saraphina, continuing to rummage through her jewelry box, replied that it was a keepsake from her father, so it would be a shame if the jewelry were completely lost. So she asked the maid if she could find it. The new maid bowed and said that of course she could do it, and asked the lady to describe it, and she would watch and look for it while she cleaned. Saraphina, smiling, immediately said that it was a brooch with a yellow topaz in the middle. Therefore, she asked that the maids be sure to let her know as soon as they found it. The maid smiled and said that she could rely on her, and also added that Count Danclio would arrive very soon. When the girl heard about this, you immediately looked at her in surprise and asked who he was, because you really didn't know. And the maid, continuing to sort through things, smiled happily and said that this was, of course, her philosophy mentor, who would now teach her. After some time, Saraphina actually went down to the guest room, where the man was already waiting for her. He, seeing the lady, said that a lot of time had passed since they last saw each other. The girl curtsied in greeting and said that it had indeed been some time since her last visit. After that, the man looked at her carefully and said that she looked quite well groomed that day, and this was indeed the case. For their meeting, she wore a rather beautiful dress that perfectly emphasized her figure, as well as some jewelry. As soon as she heard this, she immediately smiled and said that she realized that she needed to change herself and her style of clothing a little, and that is why she completely changed her wardrobe. Smiling, the man said that she had a commendable attitude. After that, he sat down on the sofa, invited her to sit opposite him, and said that he would like to begin their lesson. However, before he could begin it, the girl turned to him and, asking for forgiveness, said that she did not want to interfere. However, she also wanted to say something. He was a little surprised when she said this, but sighing heavily, he immediately asked what she wanted to tell him. He immediately thought that she was going to come up with some new excuse for skipping class. He even wondered what it would be this time. Looking him straight in the eye, the girl said that she no longer wanted to attend his lessons, and from that day on, he no longer needed to visit their estate. When he heard this, he was a little surprised, and asking for forgiveness for his harshness, he asked if she even realized how far behind she had fallen in her studies during this time. Saraphina answered in a calm voice that she understood everything perfectly well and had made this decision consciously. But the teacher persisted and said that if she knew that avoiding the problem was not her solution, then she should understand that it would be better for her. He also said that, besides all this, he was teaching her under the direct orders of His Majesty the Emperor, so her desire to skip classes would not be sufficient grounds for him to leave. Then the girl, smiling slightly, suggested settling their dispute with a test. She replied that it would be the fastest way to prove her abilities to him, and that she no longer needed his services. Smiling, Saraphina said that if she couldn't turn him in, he could even punish her as he saw fit. However, after some time, when this test was written and the girl did just fine, the man found himself on the street and was incredibly surprised that she had actually been able to do it. But after him, the teacher of karyology, etiquette, and even science was also kicked out, because Saraphina set the same condition for all of them and did an excellent job. And so, as they left the territory of her estate, she watched all this from the window and was glad that she was able to deal with all of them in one day. Of course, staying up all night to prepare for this difficult test was incredibly difficult for her, but it was worth it in the end, so she is not even disappointed. So now that she no longer had such interruptions as lessons, she had time for herself, which made her incredibly happy. The girl decided that it was time for her to get her weapons back. Of course, she knew that all 8 of those weapons she had created were eternal, so they still exist somewhere. Saraphina realized that she could find their location by looking at historical records, so that's what she was going to do. With this in mind, she immediately began to study the records, but could not find any recent traces of this very weapon. Historical records only mentioned that, after the fall of the kingdom, weapons were scattered in all directions. And from some point on, their location remained completely unknown to people, so she could not find out where it was with the help of these records. The princess was very curious about what could have happened, and also whether her weapon could have simply been destroyed, and she would never see it again. The weapon would remember what happened 500 years ago, and if the girl could find it, she might find out why she ended up in this body. But then suddenly, sitting on the floor and reading one of the books, Saraphina noticed something strange. She was immediately very surprised. But before she had time to carefully read this information, a maid suddenly entered her room and said that Duke Rubia was calling her. As soon as she heard about this, you were very surprised and asked, "Does father really want to see her?" By the time Saraphina got to his office, the sun was already setting outside. As soon as she got inside, she said she heard him calling her to his office. The man, who had raven black hair, only told her in a rough voice to come in and sit down. This man was Robert, and he was her father. As she began to come closer, he said that she had been acting rather quiet lately. Saraphina replied that this was indeed the case, and as she sat down opposite him, Robert said that he had heard that her teachers had left, declaring that they had nothing more to teach her. He also said that the emperor was very interested in this matter. The girl replied that she had simply shown what she knew, so there should be no problem. But Robert continued to insist on his own, and asked her what she could say in her defense for throwing away all her old dresses, because he considered this a rather strange act. Saraphina, lowering her head, replied that she had decided to sort out what she no longer needed and remove it from her wardrobe. Of course, she understood that he would not mention her stay in prison, because for him it was not a very pleasant topic. After that, Robert quickly changed the subject and asked how her health was now. And the girl, smiling, answered that everything was the same as usual. Getting up from his seat, the man said that he would not continue to pay attention to her fickleness for now, because he was sure that this would change in a few days. So he believed that he had no need to worry. Of course, the girl doesn't want to waste time on unnecessary conversations, so she just kept silent when he said this. And after that, turning to her father, she replied that she would like to talk to him about something. When he asked what exactly she wanted to discuss, the girl said she was planning to go out. Seeing his surprised expression, Saraphina explained that she thought she wanted to take a little walk and explore the city. Her father was a little surprised by this, but immediately asked how much time she would need for this. Hearing about this, Saraphina asked what he was talking about, because she was sure that he would immediately refuse her. But the man said in a calm voice that she was telling him this because she needed money. So he asked her why she was throwing away her dress, but now he sees that she has spent all her savings. At that moment, he started writing something in his documents and asked her not to protest next time, but to simply ask him directly for money, since there was no problem with that for them. Saraphina was very surprised, but when she wanted to say that this was not at all true, she was again seized with a violent cough, and she had to remain silent for a while. When her father saw that she had been coughing for quite a long time, he immediately asked, "Is she really sick again?" And indignantly, he added that she had said that she was fine. After a short cough, the girl said that it was absolutely nothing, and he did not need to worry. However, at that moment she felt even worse. Saraphina suddenly saw darkness coming before her eyes, and literally a second later she fell unconscious to the floor, even falling off the chair. Her father reacted to this immediately and carried the girl to her own room, and then he called a doctor to examine her carefully and tell her what was wrong. The man, having carefully examined the girl, said that she most likely just caught a cold, so there was no reason to worry. Her father, upon hearing about this, said that it was simply impossible for this to happen. If she had felt even a little bit bad, she would have definitely complained to him, but she eventually said that everything was fine. Of course, he was very indignant, because before this she always spoke up when something was wrong. However, now she kept silent about the fact that she felt bad. The doctor tried to calm His Highness down, but he also said that just because she didn't say or show it, it didn't mean she wasn't in pain or that the illness was gone. So he added that she was usually so careful about her health. However, now she neglected even drinking special medicines. He also found it strange and thought about something. But at that moment the maid burst in, and seeing the lady lying on the bed became very frightened. Saraphina's father came closer to her and immediately asked what had happened and why she had burst in so abruptly. Stammering with fear, the maid said that they had found a thief who had stolen something that was very valuable to the girl, and so she had come to tell her about it directly. The man, looking at the maid, was very surprised and asked what kind of thing it was that she valued. The poor girl replied that it was a special brooch that she had been looking for all this time. They had found it in the headmaid's room. As soon as the man heard about this, he immediately started shouting and told her to immediately bring this headmaid to him because he would need to talk to her urgently. Saraphina, at this point, who was beginning to come to her senses, realized that she felt simply disgusting. So in a very quiet and hoarse voice, she asked for some water to be brought to her. But as soon as the girl opened her eyes, she saw some strange guy who, handing her a glass of water, asked if this was what she needed. Of course, the girl was incredibly surprised when she saw him, and immediately sat up on the bed and asked, "Is this really Icarus?" But when this guy spoke, she saw a completely different appearance. It was a man with blonde hair, and he asked who she was even asking about. He also said in an indignant voice that he had come to take care of her, and now she had confused him with some of her friends. This was a little offensive to him. At that moment, Saraphina understood perfectly well who this man was. It was Joshua, and he was her younger brother. When the girl was about to tell him something, he nevertheless handed her a glass of water and, turning away, asked who else she was going to confuse him with. Saraphina took the glass of water from him at that moment, and he asked her if it was true that she had recently fallen into the fountain. But he also said that it was no wonder that everyone was blushing, since she did that all the time. Her personality was real pain, and she knew it very well. Smiling, the girl turned to him and said that he must have been very worried about her, since he had come such a long way. Joshua, upon hearing this suggestion, immediately became angry and said that of course it was not so. But Saraphina at that moment thought that thanks to those memories of her character, this man now did not feel like a complete stranger. When she was around this guy, she felt relieved because he was someone she already knew from her memories. It didn't make her feel lost. After a short silence, Joshua spoke to her again and said that her father had fired the headmaid because she was accused of stealing her things. So he asked the girl what exactly Saraphina had done this time to make it a reality. As soon as she heard this, she was immediately surprised and asked her brother why he thought it was she who did something, since the maid had been kicked out. Joshua looked very serious and, in a rough voice, replied that it was all because she always behaved like that, and most importantly, the maid claimed that it was Saraphina who gave her this brooch. But the girl smiled, shook her head, and asked, "Does her brother really trust others more than his own sister?" She also added that she had no reason to falsely accuse someone just to have that person thrown out of the estate, and asked, "Doesn't he think so?" Joshua suddenly felt very uncomfortable, even ashamed for a moment, and turning away, he said that he was just asking, nothing more. He himself did not understand what was happening to his sister, because she usually never behaved like this. For a while he just silently studied her appearance, and then said that at least that damn wing didn't appear from behind her back. That was already a plus. As soon as Saraphina heard about this, she immediately became interested, but she pretended to be completely indifferent to his words and said that it was just a slight cold. In fact, Lady Rubia, it was Saraphina who suffered from a rare disease that caused wings to grow on her body. People with the rare disease usually died before they even reached adulthood. This was because their life energy mana, which should have been evenly distributed throughout their body, was concentrated into forming their wings. There was no specific treatment for the disease, and Saraphina had to seal her wings with medicine and magic circles to ensure that they would never break through again. However, all of this was only temporary. On the day her wings suddenly spread and her mother went out of control, her body was significantly damaged, and if it were to happen again, she might even die. Now the girl who was in Saraphina's body understood that she could finally grow wings. However, if this happens and she uses them, she will simply die. So she was incredibly sad to realize this. Then suddenly Joshua walked away from her for a while, and when he returned, he handed her a bottle of medicine. He told her to take these medications, and Saraphina, sitting on the bed, asked why he still didn't leave. She had already woken up, and he was absolutely not obliged to be there. The guy was immediately very surprised and asked why she was asking this question, and also asked, does his presence really irritate her? While finally handing her the medicine, Joshua also asked why she didn't throw the cup at him as she usually did, but just spoke calmly. Saraphina, hearing about this, was a little surprised. She immediately realized that she really was not behaving like the girl before, so she looked carefully around the room. After that, she was about to take a glass of water and swung at the guy. Joshua immediately began to cover his face with his hands. But as soon as the girl threw one thing at him, he was very surprised, because it was a candy, and not a glass as he expected. Joshua immediately looked at his sister in surprise, and she, as she lay back down on the bed, told him to come back later. She would leave him his favorite flavor for candy. He also asked her what flavor he liked, but the guy didn't answer. He turned around and started to leave, saying that he would come even if she didn't give him candy. So he asked her to just go to bed. When the guy finally left her alone, she, lying in bed, thought about the fact that he most likely does not like strawberry-flavored candies. Some time passed from that moment, and Joshua came to take care of Saraphina every day. He only did two things when he showed up at her place unannounced. One was that he started a verbal altercation, and the second was that he always watched her when she took her medication. When the guy did his daily duties, he would just leave silently, satisfied that she had taken her medicine, and now he could be calm. And then one day when Joshua was starting to leave again, she asked him if he had anything to say at all. The guy, walking further and further towards the door, replied that, of course, he didn't want to tell her anything, but was simply leaving. But Saraphina suddenly asked him to stop and then threw some candies at him, telling him to take them with him when he left. The guy, of course, was very surprised, but he did not refuse them, and putting them in his pocket, simply left. And so, after some time, when Joshua came to visit his sister again, he suddenly saw that she was no longer lying in her bed. He immediately became wary and in an angry voice asked why she had gotten up, and the girl replied that she felt fine and also added that she had been sick with a cold for too long, so it was time to get better. After this, she looked at him and asked if he could do her one favor that she would really like. Joshua was a little wary at first, but then Saraphina asked him to go outside with her. Seeing his surprised expression, the girl explained that she needed him to take her somewhere in the city because she needed to confirm something in her theory. In the end, the guy finally agreed, and after some time, Saraphina got ready and they finally left for the city. Joshua walked behind and asked his sister to walk a little slower, and also asked if she hadn't said that they were going to an art gallery to look at paintings. He also said in an indignant voice that he did not understand at all why she was in a hurry all the time. But then suddenly the girl finally stopped and said that this was not what she needed. After that, she turned around and started walking away somewhere else. The guy was very surprised and asked what she meant by that and where she was going. However, Saraphina ignored him completely. What she had to see, what she had to verify, was one person. She believed that if what she had seen in that history book the last time she read it was true, then it changed everything. And then suddenly, Saraphina approached one painting in the gallery and noticed a portrait of the very man she was looking for. She simply froze in place, carefully examining his appearance, and was very glad that she had finally found Icarus. In fact, in the history book, Icarus was described as a single man who devoured gods. Not only did he exterminate all the members of the ancient royal family, but he also tore off their wings. This is how he earned his title. Thanks to this, Icarus gained power that was equal to that of a man with a divine bloodline, and with this power he created an entire empire, people. And before all this happened, Icarus was a boy who was beaten and bullied constantly, and it was the gods who beat this boy. They taught him, and when the boy did something wrong, they always beat him with a very strong whip. Saraphina studied, and he served punishment if she did something wrong, and that's why the guy became so angry. One day, when the girl completed the assignment, the teacher checked and said that she had made one mistake again. And then he walked up to the poor guy who was on his knees and said that he was going to keep beating him until she got it right. The teacher also said that this boy would take the punishment instead of her, so he asked her to start doing the task again immediately. When their lessons were over, the girl always called poor Icarus to her, who was left with many different wounds and bruises. The girl sat in her room and told him to come in and sit down, because she had prepared a first aid kit in advance in order to help him at least a little. Of course, the guy, when he saw all this, was very surprised, because he did not expect that she would show him any mercy. But the girl insisted and said that she would not punish him, but simply asked him to sit down next to her and lift his clothes. The guy didn't know if it would be the right decision. However, he listened to her and pulled up his sleeves, which showed many bruises and scratches. She immediately touched his hand and asked for forgiveness in a sad voice, saying that it was her fault because of her he suffered. After that, the guy sat down on a chair and said that he was fine, so she shouldn't worry. Saraphina, meanwhile, had already begun to treat his wounds, and the guy said that he had only done what he had to do, so he hoped that she would not stain her hands with his blood. The girl immediately lowered her head. She felt a little ashamed about all this, and she asked him not to say such things. After some time, she completely processed and wrapped his hands, asking what his name was. The boy was very surprised to hear this question, and Saraphina explained that even if he was deprived of his freedom and forced to do unpleasant things, he should still have a name, and she would like to know it. The guy remained silent for a while, and then said that he actually didn't have a name. Saraphina, then finishing the procedures, said that she wanted to know if he would allow her to name him in that case. The boy shook his head and said that of course she could do it. And then the girl gave him the name Icarus. It was the name of a man who had once had wings, though now they both had no wings. Saraphina, smiling, began to get up from her seat and said that someday there will come a time when it will not matter at all whether people have these wings or not. The guy was a little sad. He hung his head down, thanked her for actually giving him a name and saying those encouraging words. The girl herself smiled at him one last time and said that she was always happy to help a good person. In fact, after that she didn't sleep every night and concentrated on her studies so as not to cause poor Icarus any more pain. She really hoped that he would not get injured anymore because of her, and this thought made the girl happy. Finally, when a whole year had passed, the time came when the beaten Icarus was no longer needed by Saraphina. She came to her father one day and asked him for something. Of course, the man was wary at first, but he agreed to do it. And finally, the ceremony of knighting a free man, Icarus, was to take place. When the ceremony took place, the boy stood on one knee in front of the girl and said that he would be her wings, promising that he would always be faithful to Saraphina. At the ceremony, the guy was incredibly happy and said that from that moment on, he swears to be her sword and shield, no matter what it costs him, and to protect only her for the rest of his life. Now, as Saraphina stood before his portrait, she thought about how he had been such a loyal knight of the kingdom. However, in the end, he had killed his entire family and become the unfortunate emperor. Joshua was finally able to approach the girl. He asked if everything was okay with her, because she had a very sad expression on her face. But looking at her brother, she smiled and, coming closer to him, asked if he could stand in the position in which she had placed him for a while. Joshua, of course, was very surprised by her request, but he agreed. Then she came closer to him and began to hug him tightly. She stood in this pose for some time and was even ready to cry, but she held back her emotions. After that, she moved away from her brother and suggested that they go back. Then they called a carriage and, already closer to evening, finally arrived back at the estate. And at that moment, as soon as they got out of the carriage, the two of them were incredibly surprised, because a very unexpected person appeared in front of them. This man was Icarus. He was also the elder brother and son of the Duke of Rubia. The man looked closely at his brother and sister and said that they were returning somehow late. Joshua at this point began to get incredibly worried. He considered this the worst thing and did not understand why he came at all. because she cannot be interfered with when she is in such a state. Eris came closer to the girl and said that he heard that she was in pain. However, now that he sees her in person, it seems to him that everything is fine. Saraphina, smiling, replied that, of course, everything was fine with her, since several days had already passed since she felt terrible. Then the guy said that Grandma would be back very soon, and his father was busy, so he told him to give her one thing. He just started to hand her this thing, and Saraphina was very surprised and asked what it was. She looked at the bag and the package her brother had handed her, and he explained that she might not need it now. However, these were some medicines that were good for colds. And the second thing was those earrings that she had wanted so much before. When Saraphina opened the package and saw these decorations, they were really incredibly beautiful. Ares said he thought her plan worked this time because she changed her approach a little. They were all silent for a while. Then the man turned to her in a stern voice and said that she should remember that because she lost consciousness, she missed the meeting with the crown prince. And so, now that she was well enough to go out, he wondered if she thought it was time to keep the promise she had failed to keep at first. Saraphina, hearing this, was a little surprised, but passing by her brother, she pushed him with her hand and told him not to talk to her in that way under any circumstances. After that, she turned around and smiled, saying that she felt like he was interrogating her. She also said that she would definitely meet the crown prince, so he shouldn't worry. Eris, wary, said that he had intended to postpone the meeting if she was still unwell. However, since she was now well, he believed that there was no need. She kept smiling and said that of course she had always been like that, so she wouldn't mind doing it. After that, the guy turned around and, starting to leave, said that their meeting with the crown prince would take place the next morning. Until then, she could rest peacefully. Saraphina, hearing about this, was very surprised. She thought that since the meeting was acknowledged so quickly, it was most likely something important. When her older brother left, she thought that the crown prince had cheated on his fiancée Saraphina with his childhood friend, so she thought that she should see what he looked like. Some time passed from that moment, and finally it was time to meet the crown prince. The maid who helped Saraphine get dressed was a little worried. She was very hesitant and asked the girl if she really wanted His Highness, the crown prince, to see her in such an outfit. After all, she thought that it looked too simple for a meeting with her fiancé. The girl was indeed wearing a rather simple but very elegant brown dress that fit her perfectly around the waist. Smiling, Saraphina said that she didn't think it was a problem at all. So a carriage soon arrived, and she set off for the estate of the crown prince, her fiancé. When she arrived, the coachman helped her out of the carriage. Then the girl stopped and began to look around. She was absolutely sure that all this was specially organized in honor of her arrival. The girl looked to the side and saw a lady there who was Melanie Bazalan. She was the daughter of the Empress's beloved servant, and also a childhood friend of the crown prince, and the person whom absolutely everyone knew as the mistress of the crown prince, so Saraphina was not at all happy about such a meeting. As she began to approach the entrance of the estate, she thought that even though the crown prince clearly knew that his bride would be coming to visit, he still invited his mistress there as well. The girl thought that this was not surprising at all, because after all, she was the person who never contacted the girl, even when she was in prison, or when she lost her community. Saraphina was led into the gazebo where her fiancé was already sitting and waiting for the girl. As soon as he saw that someone had entered, he immediately looked at her. It was Leonard von Fahm, the one and only crown prince of the empire, with whom absolutely all the ladies were in love. As soon as Saraphina looked at him, she immediately thought that this man was a descendant of Kara, because she heard that he never married and continued his lineage through adoption. However, this guy was completely different from him. The girl, without even saying hello, walked forward and sat down opposite him. Then Leonard spoke first and said that she looked a little different that day. Saraphina, showing no interest in this conversation, immediately asked what was wrong with that. But he didn't answer. When the guy looked at his bride, he realized that she was not only different, but also completely quiet, as if she were alone. But it didn't matter at all, because he believed that very soon she would start whining as usual, so this happiness would definitely not last long for him. After a moment of silence, Leonard turned to her, saying that he had heard that all the mentors who had been sent by the imperial family had returned, praising the girl's intelligence. He said that he certainly didn't expect this from her, and he also didn't think that she would be so dedicated to her studies. Leonard said he thought she would make a wonderful empress. Saraphina smiled and said it was a good time since they had brought it up, and added that he must have a very busy schedule. So, laughing, the girl suggested that they break off their engagement, because she did not want to have all this useless small talk that was of no use. When the guy heard this, he was so confused that he even forgot to make a normal expression on his face. After a short silence, he said that it was rather rude of her to say such things. He laughed nervously and said that an engagement was not such a silent thing as a child's game, and if it was broken off, they would never be able to return to their previous state. It would be forever. Leonard also said that he had told her about this before, but she was too capricious to listen to him properly. Saraphina had no intention of sitting and humiliating herself in front of him for long, so she stood up from her seat and said that she didn't care at all what he thought at all. She explained that she had told him about it in advance only because it might catch him by surprise when an official request to break off the engagement suddenly arrived. The man was truly incredibly surprised, but he decided not to waste time and ran closer to her, grabbed her hand and asked, was it really because he needed to use a lot of magic that day? He also said that she should know that only he could handle the magic she needed, so he wouldn't advise her to make such decisions. Leonard also said that if she was rebelling just to get his interest, then she did a good job of it. And on this day, he might even say that she won. Saraphina pulled her hand away from him and said that she didn't think someone who didn't even bother to contact her when she was sick had the right to say things like that. She also said that she thought His Highness was already waiting for his mistress in the garden and asked if he shouldn't go and visit her, as it would be very impolite. Without waiting for his answer, Saraphina turned and began to leave. Closer to sunset, she finally returned to the estate and immediately went to her room. For some time, no one bothered the girl, but towards evening, a maid came to her, and Saraphina immediately asked what was going on. And the maid replied that the master had asked her to dine with them all. Saraphina, hearing this, was a little surprised and even distracted herself from reading her book. The maid, coming closer to her, held a box in her hands and said that for the last time she wanted to wear the diamond earrings that she had just received as a gift, and she thought that this was a good occasion to do so. After thinking for a while, the girl finally agreed and, changing into another dress, she began to put on the earrings that her older brother had given her. But then suddenly her sleeves lifted up a little and she saw scars on her arms. Also, for the first time, as soon as Saraphina reincarnated into this body, she immediately noticed signs that her first owner had resorted to self-harm, and she was incredibly curious. Did the father know that his daughter was harming herself in order to attract the attention of her family? That father, who had never paid attention to his daughter until now, suddenly gave her earrings, but Saraphina thought that this was done only to try to find out his daughter's feelings now that she had changed. She thought that if this was really so, then Saraphina was too pitiful. But when the girl finished her preparations, she turned to the maid and said that on this day, pearls would be more attractive than diamonds. Smiling, the maid said that, of course, she understood everything. And Saraphina thought that in any case, she did not need to be a good daughter, so she decided to act as she saw fit. At this very time, the father, who was the head of the family, and his two sons were already downstairs and waiting for Saraphina. The elder brother turned to the man and said that he had heard that His Imperial Majesty the Emperor had made contact with the house of Duke Sapphire that day. The man, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked, did he really do this personally to Duke Sapphire? His son replied that he was of course not sure, but that was the impression he had gotten from hearing the news. For a while the father was silent, after which Saraphina finally came, and he asked her, is it true that you visited the palace that day? When the girl nodded her head in agreement, he asked, how is the crown prince doing? Saraphina was silent for a while. Then, sighing heavily, she said that there was nothing special or unusual. Everything was as usual. However, her father at that moment noticed the earrings the girl was wearing and noticed that they were not the diamond ones he had given her, but pearl ones. This made him a little wary and even angry to some extent. For a while, everyone at the table was silent. Then he said that these earrings suited her very well. Saraphina thanked him for the compliments, said that she received the gift he gave her, but decided to wear different earrings. She explained her decision by saying that the outfit she wore to dinner that day did not quite match them, so she was unable to present his gift properly. Then her father said that he had been a little careless, and that he should have also given her a dress to match the earrings, so he asked her for forgiveness for that. But Saraphina, smiling, said that everything was fine and that there was no need for it at all. Joshua, who at that moment was sitting silently and watching this conversation, suddenly became very surprised and said that she really knows how to work her head very well. After that, the guy added that this time she finally thinks with her brain, not her body. When Saraphina heard this, she got very angry and asked, looking at him, what he was saying. Then suddenly their father interrupted them, saying that he had heard that she was the first to raise the topic of breaking off the engagement with His Highness the Crown Prince. At this point, Saraphina was already a little uncomfortable and, in a rough voice looking at her father, she said that this was indeed so. When the man said that this was a matter that concerned the royal family, and she should have consulted him at least before making any decision at all, he explained that if this continued, it would be simply impossible to stop their engagement with His Highness. But Saraphina, waving her hand, said that she was not interested in this at all. Joshua, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked how this was possible, because she acted as if she was head over heels in love with him, and even pretended to be dead, just so that he would be near. But the girl, in a rough voice, said that as soon as she became an adult, she planned to leave this family, and that was why she mentioned breaking off the engagement, which she absolutely did not need. She also wondered if it would not be better for her father if she, as a disgrace to the family, left them and did not ruin their reputation anymore. Her father, upon hearing this, was at first incredibly surprised, after which he began to shout at his daughter, asking where she had even learned to say such terrible words to her family. He looked at his youngest son and wondered when she had learned to be cheeky and talk just like Joshua. But Saraphina interrupted him and asked him not to raise his voice at her. After that, she stood up from her seat and said that she would leave first. Her older brother sat for a while and watched the girl go. Then, when the door slammed shut, he stood up from his seat and said that he would follow her. When the father was left alone with his youngest son, he was furious. He understood perfectly well that even if the girl simply left, this issue would not be resolved completely. However, at that moment, the doors to the banquet hall opened and a girl walked in. When Joshua saw her, he was so surprised that he even opened his mouth. This woman, who was wearing a rather elegant and very beautiful green dress, folded her arms across her chest and, looking at the man, asked what had just happened. She looked very angry and even strict.